Recording in progress.
We will, I'm sure, concentrate for talking, so.
Stone level from our keep going.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Sound 10.
Okay, good.
Although I can't read. And Mark,
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
right, we're cooking with gas, as they say.
All right. We're live. Okay, great. So, welcome to this afternoon's session on defense requirements and policy. We have Mr. Andrew Parrott, and remotely we have with us Cliff Purvis. So, first of all, welcome both of you to our panel. We look forward to hearing your wisdom and insights. So, why don't we begin with Andrew? Just first of all, if you could begin by just talking a little bit about your experience before you go into your
Thank you very much, Mark. I served in the British Army for 37.5 years, from the age of 17.5 till 55, and retired as a Lieutenant Colonel in 2012. That of itself doesn't qualify me at all particularly to speak here, but between 1999 and 2003, I served as the first member of the British Armed Forces to be posted to the independent Republic of Estonia as an instructor at the then new Baltic Defence College, which was a tri-service, tri-national college for teaching the mid-peace officers of the Estonian, Latvian and Lithuanian armed forces. So for 4 years I was intimately involved in the development of all the Baltic armed forces, seeing them actually over 4 years then developing greatly and developing considerably. As a result of being there, I ended up with a Lithuanian wife, and I was actually in Tartu 10 days ago and Tallinn 12 days ago and Vilnius till Thursday evening. So life for me is very much shared between an aspiration, if you like, for an independent Scotland and living the dream of independent small countries in the Baltic states. I'm feeling quite emotional having just watched the Estonia film next door, because there's a huge amount there that I can relate to very greatly, and I could tell stories about Estonia, frankly till you were probably bored, but I'll tell you just one to start with, if I may. One of my students at the Baltic Defence College was a chap called Meelis Kili, who was a captain in the Estonian Army in 1999. He went on to be their defence attaché in London, to command the college he'd been a student at, and ultimately was the commander of the Estonian Reserve Army, the Kites Elite. I noticed from his documents that Meelis had joined the Estonian Army about 5 days after independence was declared. And I asked Meelis, how did you actually join the Estonian Army in those days? And he said, oh, I joined because General Ants Larnot phoned me up and asked me if I'd join. And I said to him, okay, why was General Ants, who at that stage, when I knew him, was the commander of the Estonian defense, the Estonian military college, which was next door to our college, I said, why was General Ants phoning round, asking people to join? He said, oh, because the day before he phoned me, Mark Lahr, the Prime Minister, had phoned him up and said, Ants, we're independent now, we need an army to start sorting one out. So I said to Meelis, I said, when you joined, how many people were there in the Estonian Army? He said, oh, I think I was about number 12. So I would hope, one of the reasons for telling that story is, I hope, if you like, the beginnings of a Scottish Defence Force are perhaps, hopefully in the future, not quite as fundamental as that. But it remains to be seen. The first thing I would say is that actually we don't seek independence in Scotland because we want to form our own armed forces. But if you like, defence and security is, if you like, a responsibility of the government of a sovereign state. That fundamental requirement to protect the population from fear and want. And therefore, if you like, we're seeking independence for other very good reasons, but one of the responsibilities that comes with independence is having our own defence and security policies and the armed forces or the defence forces that back those up. One thing I'm not going to mention at all today, other than in the next couple of minutes, is nuclear weapons. For me, nuclear weapons are a foreign policy issue for an independent Scotland. They are not a defence and security issue. They are something that we have to negotiate with other powers the removal of. Just actually as the Estonians had to do with the nuclear submarine base at Paldiski. And if people are interested at the end, I'll tell you a bit about that. Frankly, for my money, what was said in the white paper in 2013-2014 about defence was not very strong. It concentrated on equipment and units that we might have, but that's actually a second-order issue. What is far more important to me, and what I would just like to see more of the debate centred on, is the missions of a Scottish Defence Force, the tasks and the purposes for which we have those forces. I put together a presentation which, in the autumn of 2019, which I gave a presentation to the SNP Strathspey branch, where I have a few friends, and the intention had been to take that round to other places, but COVID rather got in the way from spring 2020. However, I shared that presentation with Jeff Bush, and I'm happy for him to share it to any of the attendants today, so that will be going round. That does actually get into more detail on my idea, just one idea, of what the Scottish Defence Force might look at, or might have. But first I want to concentrate, if you like, on a few of the tasks that a Scottish Defence Force would have. And it's out of an understanding of those tasks, or an acceptance by politicians that those tasks are valid, that the force structures would begin to emerge. Primary for me, if you like, the first task is defending the sovereignty of Scotland. Its land, its maritime zone, the economic zone, and its airspace. And there are a whole variety of things that you can think of as to the degree and the extent to which we might choose to do that. The second task for me is contribute to collective defence as an aspirant member of NATO, if not an actual one initially, and an aspirant member of the EU, and if not an actual member initially. I am making no apologies. I am a fan of both the EU and of NATO. And to me, you only have to look to places further east of here and to see the Swedes and the Finns' response to what the Russians are presently doing. NATO may not be perfect, but it's the best we've got. And I'm a firm believer in collective defence, and I'm a firm believer that the independent Scotland should be a member of NATO. Others may choose to differ. We may accept as a task contributing to humanitarian operations as a member of the United Nations and of ultimately the European Union. I hope it wouldn't take us very long to join the United Nations. The Irish Armed Forces, if you ask the Irish what their armed forces are for, they will say they are to defend Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. But most of their actual employment, most of their experience during the period of independence of Ireland since the Second World War comes from experience on UN missions. Another task that I think would be important is to undertake specific tasks in support of Scotland's civil authorities and in cooperation with appropriate domestic agencies. I say that because as a small country, Scotland has got to make some fairly basic decisions, I think, about keeping structures simple. When I first went to Estonia, if I remember correctly, they had something they called the Navy with about 3 ships. They had a border guard, which had ships as well. They had a coast guard, which had ships as well. They had maritime police, who had small craft too, and I think the customs people ran ships too. That for a country of 1.3 million? No. My view very firmly is that any government aviation or shipping assets in an independent Scotland should ultimately come within the ambit of a naval force or an air component. Perhaps working with other agents, tasked by other agencies, but we should keep the structures simple and keep those all within the ambit, to me, of the armed forces. One thing that I've not previously included in equipment that an air component might have is aircraft for helping fight wildfires. I think we're reaching the stage of climate change where if a Scottish Air Force or air component had a small number of firefighting aircraft, that probably would be a useful addition to the organisation. And the final task that I would say that we need to have and consider is the task of being prepared to expand capabilities to meet new or increasing threats. If you rule that out as a task, you have what you have, and there is no authority, if you like, for the armed forces to consider the possibility or the prospect of having to get bigger to meet new or different threats. And that to me is important. I think actually London might be regarded as guilty of not considering new and increasing threats in recent years, and still are. The idea that the British Army should reduce from 83,000 to 72,000 with everything that's going on in the East at the moment, to me is a nonsense. And we're now actually getting to the stage where, as a proportion of the population, the Irish Republic's army is bigger than the British Army. Most people don't think of the Irish as being reasonably well armed, but in simple numbers, I know there's a lot more to it than that, the Irish army is almost at the stage where proportionately it's bigger than the British army. So those, if you like, are 5 task areas that I believe should drive the structures that a Scottish Defence Force should adopt. And I believe that any white paper that is published ahead of an independence referendum should, if you like, concentrate on those tasks and purposes of a Scottish Defence Force and not get into the business of saying we should have this unit or that piece of equipment. We should also, in the white paper, get into, I believe, the preferred international context that we would be operating in, and I've already made it clear where I stand on that. The history of countries that have sought neutral positions has not actually ultimately been very good. Belgium wanted to be neutral, Denmark wanted to be neutral, Norway did. Ireland was neutral in the Second World War, but with a considerable degree of compromise, as was Sweden. There are then, if you like, a whole variety of fairly fundamental issues that have to be addressed in terms of establishing defence and security forces. The first thing that has to be looked at is what sort of personnel model are we looking at? I think there's an assumption that we might follow the regular reserve model of professional soldiers that the British military has at the moment. I actually think that that's probably ultimately what might be most sensible. But I don't think that should be taken as an assumption. We should be looking carefully at what the models are. Finland is perhaps the only country in Europe that has sustained universal conscription for its entire adult male young population, and Finland, with a population of 5.25 million, can put about 500,000 uniformed people into the field within about 7 days of needing to. They still have every adult male in Finland knows what their military job is, and as my Finnish boss in Estonia said to me, Russia was there in 1940, Russia is still there now. Arguments about NATO are irrelevant for the Finns, it's that long border with Russia. But that's why they have conscription, because they need forces that only conscription can give them. We could go for a Danish model, which relies far more on volunteers, but doesn't keep many of them in full-time service. And there are other models you could go to. The Swedish still retain conscription, but it's a sort of selective conscription by ballot, which is not particularly satisfactory in various ways, but it means that they can reduce the numbers. Interestingly, Estonia has always retained conscription. The Lithuanians, having moved about 10 years ago to a professional structure more like the British structures, has actually gone back to conscription. Not because they lack volunteers, but because they feel with an increased threat they need to have a larger base to their armed forces. We need to look at the basic service structures. We've traditionally looked at a separate air force, an army and a navy. The Canadians went to a single service model. It hasn't been particularly successful. People like their own single service ethos. And for my money, even within a small structure, we should retain distinct, separate land force, maritime force and air force components, but with far more joint organisation of, if you like, the backroom logistics. We then need to look at the whole business of training structures, career training, trade training, collective training, what we're training for, how we're training and where we do it. A vital area of concern is against the tasks that you've been set up to perform, what are your logistic structures? And I read something just this morning before I left home saying that the British Army could probably fight for about 14 days at the scale of fighting that, if you like, if the whole of the army is involved, at the sort of scale of fighting that's going on in Ukraine. That is woefully inadequate. Even during the Cold War, our ammunition stocks were not huge, but we could fight for a good bit longer than that. And if I was to share with you the fact that since the end of the Cold War, whilst the number of people in uniform in the regular British forces is now just under half of what it was in, I think, 1990, the logistic stocks that back up that armed force are between 20 and 25% of what they used to be. They have been very, very considerably thinned out. And I'm not arguing for any particular level. What I'm saying is that if you have a set of tasks that your armed or defence forces are configured to do, you have to make sure that you have the logistic stocks and structures in place to allow those to be prosecuted if need be. We need to look at a basing policy. Where are we going to base things? Many of these things, I think, would become, there's no point in building brand new. For me, there's a perfectly serviceable airbase at Lossiemouth which might be inherited. I would certainly think of Prestwick as being a secondary base, the training base and logistics base for an air component. When it came to naval forces, Scapa Flow had a very good reputation as a naval base and could be again. And all I would say here is that, for my money, Faslane is probably one of the worst places to choose for a naval base. It is a long way from the sea. You're giving yourself considerable extra expense of sailing into very narrow waters that can be blocked very easily and quite quickly by anyone who wants to. If we want a West Coast base, perhaps a reinvigoration of one of the airship ports might be a good idea. But the whole business of basing and where the armed forces would be based would have to be looked at. There's then the whole business of, if you like, the military-industrial complex, as some call it, defence procurement. Scotland would always, as a small country, be reliant on purchasing equipment and logistic stocks from friends and neighbours to a very great degree, as are the Danes, the Norwegians and others, but there is no reason at all why similarly to the Danes and the Norwegians, there might not be niche areas of enterprise in Scotland where, if you like, Scotland could make its own contribution in proper way to, if you like, the defence industrial complex. The Norwegians, I think, have a niche area in naval missiles. The Danes have something else, I can't quite remember what it is, but I'm sure they have something. And you know, there are, without doubt, areas in the electronics industry and the satellite technology industry in Scotland that Scotland could exploit as our contribution to that area. And then finally, right at the end of the list of considerations, there's the whole business of history and tradition. Would we want to keep some of the names that come out of, if you like, a British heritage? I'm not going to say yes, I'm not going to say no. All I would say is that the Irish Army got rid of all the British names and never kept them. And in fact, it was one of the biggest shocks of my life to be appointed to welcome an Irish Army officer who was visiting the Baltic Defence College. And the first thing I saw on his uniform when I met him at his hotel at breakfast was the red-handed Ulster. I had not expected to see that on an Irish Republic Army officer's uniform, but he said proudly, I'm from the Donegal battalion. Donegal is part of Ulster. And it's not only that, we're the senior battalion of the Irish Army, so it was in my place. So we have to think of those. And I've almost rabbited on for too long, but the final point I make goes back to, if you like, my opening comments about how do you create your defence force. You need to work towards a steady state against what you think your tasks and missions are. When I first went to Estonia and the Baltic states, they had been establishing their armed forces for about 8 years. It's only going back now and speaking to people who I knew as students and occasionally see, now that the Baltic states have been in existence for 30 years, they've had people who joined their armed forces as 20-year-olds, who are now 50-year-olds, who are occupying senior positions within their armed forces, and their armed forces have reached a level of maturity. They've reached a level of development that has changed over time with NATO membership, with the increasing threats they see. I didn't believe I'd see a day when I saw the Lithuanian army with tracked self-propelled artillery, but that's where they've got to now. Similarly, we mustn't, if you like, seek to hide it. A Scottish Defence Force would take time to set up. There would initially be vulnerabilities. We might have to be very, very selective about the priorities we established in the first 2 or 3 years of development for the key tasks that we felt needed doing vitally. Fishery protection, 1 or 2 others might be mentioned, air defence, but we would have to prioritise very carefully what we put assets into initially, and over time we would develop to what I might call an immature steady state after about 15 years and a mature steady state after about 30 years. And that is the state that the Balts have reached about now. But I think we mustn't pretend that everything would be present from day one. We would be starting with people coming in from other places, and we would be looking to address our priorities. And then finally, I think we would have to look, as we develop, at how we encompass new technology. Looking carefully at what's happening in Ukraine. Drone technology is making a massive difference. I have never thought that a Scottish Defence Force should look towards having tracked vehicles, but certainly some heavier equipment with wheels, like the HIMARS artillery system, which the Balts are very interested in just now, might be appropriate. And interestingly, I was hearing literally last week how the Ukrainians are exploiting mobile telephony everyone with a mobile phone in Ukraine can now download an app where they can report Russian activity to the government if they see it. That has very dangerous consequences sometimes. But equally, the Ukrainians are taking a draconian line with any of their own people who are using mobile telephones in places where they shouldn't, on the front line, to give themselves away. Absolute draconian, forbidding people from using telephony at all to give themselves away. Anyway, that's where I will conclude my comments. I'm more than happy later on to take questions, but I hope that has been of interest. Thank you.
So now we have Mr. Cliff Purvis remotely to give his views on Scottish defence.
So,
Hold on just 1 sec, and we're going to turn up the sound. You want to take ladies? You read it there in a second. You take one?
two.
Sorry for the delay, Cliff. Go ahead, please, Cliff.
Right, yeah, as I said, like Andrew, I'm ex-Army. I did 24 years in the Army, 14 years for the Queensland Highlanders, and then I moved over to the Royal Army Medical Corps and did a further 10 years as a combat medic. I've been heavily involved in the Veterans for Scottish Independence 2.0 group since its inception back in 2014, and we came about basically as a direct result of some mistruth being poured from high within the military, saying that veterans and serving forces were not in favour of an independent Scotland. Since then, I've also come active with the SSRG Armed Forces and the Veterans Group as well. I speak to serving personnel, and there is support out there for Scottish independence, but we cannot assume that those still serving on independence will automatically want to transfer in to the Scottish Defence Force. we've got to make that package inviting for them. And that's keeps coming back to that. I'm in total agreement. The defence package in the last white paper we had back in 2013-2014 was very, very poor, and it left us wide open to massive criticism. So if we are going to get our armed forces community on side, then we have to present a realistic approach to what a Scottish Defence Force will be, what its capabilities will be, etc. We definitely cannot assume that everybody will come over to us. As for the serving personnel, now we're not talking about the armed forces community. I mean the regulars with their families, the reservists with their families, and of course the veterans and their families. We're not talking to the regulars. Quite a lot of them would like to take an active part in the debate for Scottish independence, but it's still frowned upon for them to do that. So they will shy away from it. But we do have supporters in uniform for Scottish independence. But they would like us to sometimes concentrate on this package that we're going to advertise, join Scottish Defence Force. And like I'm totally in agreement that it needs to be separate Navy, air assets and Army. Because people will want to do that, the Speed Corps. They'll want to keep that in. But they will need to know, on transferring over, how will that affect any pensions that they've been paid into? Will that be a direct transfer in? As for paying allowances and stuff like that, we just need to match what's on offer now from our UK forces. And the recruitment, as Andrew touched on there, how are we going to recruit these people? Currently, it's outsourced, I believe. Will that still be the case? Where are we going to set up our recruit depots? It would be lovely and a bit nostalgia for me to see my old recruit depot up in Aberdeen and Richard on get reactivated for that one. But we have got real estate in Scotland to get these things set up. The Forces Covenant is another topic that obviously the veterans and serving personnel are very, very keen on trying to get that enshrined in law. We know what the RUK government are like with the Forces Covenant. It's only ever mentioned on the run-up to November the 11th, and then it's quickly forgotten about. We are still waiting for the pledge made by David Lloyd George way back in 1918, where he promised to make this land fit for heroes to return to. Every government since has forgotten about it. But we need to make the package interesting for the boys and girls that would want to join the forces, and included in that is deployments. There are quite people do join the military for that sense of a little bit of edge to what they're doing. So will we deploy with our allies? NATO is not a big bad thing. As Andrew quite rightly pointed out, no, it's not perfect, but it's certainly where I would want us to be. And will we carry on deploying with NATO forces? What's that going to get? How's that going to get achieved? So we've got to get it right. And I did this where I do wish someone from the SNP had actually come in today, because we need to get the policy put up to the Scottish Government that we need to get the message out to those still serving that it is an attractive prospect. We know there's chronic problems at the heart of the UK defence establishment, some of it to do with the procurement disasters and basic force design inconsistencies. So we want to definitely shy away from trying to be a mini MOD as it was. I think probably need to open things up to questions, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Cliff. So we have about about 15 minutes for questions and answers. So I see, Dave, if you could get the microphone for him.
I was informed by my daughter that Faslane nuclear base is about to have a reprocessing centre just further along. I don't know if you're aware of this. My daughter worked for SEPA, and I read a 22-page report that was top secret, it was confidential. And what the plan is, the British government are going to allow the French to bring their submarines up to Faslane, just past Faslane, to get reprocessing low-level nuclear waste and then pumped into the loch. And that's the long-term plan over the next 10 years. And I don't think people in Scotland are aware of this. Quite serious, because as you know, when it comes to nuclear submarines, accidents do and will happen. And Scotland has no need for nuclear, tiny wee country, no need for nuclear weapons. And considering we have the largest maritime sea in the whole of Europe, and every plane that goes to North America has to fly over Scotland. You know, who is Scotland's enemy right now? Who are our enemies that you can see?
Great question.
First of all, about Faslane, I'm not aware of that particular development, which does not sound attractive to me at all. I am aware that, you know, given Brexit, the UK government is keen on its close military relationship with the French, so I can quite imagine that sort of thing happening. The only nuclear presence at Faslane is, of course, the submarine reactors. The weapons never go anywhere close to Faslane. They all are loaded at Coolport and offloaded at Coolport, so the weapons don't go to Faslane as far as I'm aware. In terms of our enemies, you know, for me, Europe faces a renewed threat from Russia. It is as simple as that.
Scotland, I'm talking about Scotland.
Yeah, Scotland is part of the Western configuration to me. We share in the threat that Russia faces, that Russia provides. And make no mistake about it, Ukraine is fighting our war for us at the moment. We cannot join in that for a whole variety of geopolitical reasons. But they are bearing the brunt of a conflict that we are party to, without a doubt in my mind. The West's policy towards Ukraine ever since 1990 independence, to me, has been woeful. But there we go.
I don't want to get into the Ukraine thing and can cause difficulties. Thank you for your contribution. I was very interested, especially by what you said about acknowledging climate change and the possibility of fires. I do think collectively as a globe that probably is a bigger threat than Russia. But again, we don't want to really talk about that. If nuclear policy is a foreign policy question, what about its impact on conventional spending? Years ago, prior to the Falklands, Patty Ashdown said that our plans involve decommissioning a sea-link ferry, and there was another amphibious vehicle called Intrepid that could have been brought out of mothballs. So I actually think that too much of a focus on nuclear might have actually reduced our conventional capability, and lots of submarine captains I've talked to have felt that. In terms of numbers of troops, well, as I understand it, we probably have 10 times as many MOD bureaucrats as we do service personnel, 90,000 versus, what, 9. That's a problem. We could avoid that in an independent Scotland. I only just found out that Babcock, because what the guy was saying earlier, manages Faslane for the UK government. They also manage Plymouth, I guess, and also my downstairs neighbor's daughter has just been seconded from the FCO as a Greek ambassador for Britain to be working up here. And she was very keen to hear about, again, something I know you don't want to get into, the idea that Stuart McDonald floated that we might have to bargain, and Jim Sillers has floated this too, up for a 20-year lease with the
Could you get to the
the
question?
government. Well, those are just things I'd like to hear his opinions on,
Okay.
really. And also about NATO. If Ireland isn't in it, why do we have to be in it?
Cliff or Andrew, if you want to jump in.
Why should we be part of NATO when the Republic of Ireland isn't? I think it goes back to that collective defence. If we wish to maintain our integrity as a sovereign country, then we have to be able to look after ourselves. And NATO is the best platform for us to achieve that. As far as the nuclear decommission or recommission or whatever it is proposed for Faslane, I have no idea about that at all either, Andrew, so I haven't heard of any whispers on that at all.
Do you want to add anything?
Ireland, all I'd say is that Ireland is not a member of NATO. Ireland is like, exists under NATO's shadow. Ireland actually has recently produced a report on defence and is seriously proposing considerably upscaling their defence efforts. They're not actually talking at the moment about NATO membership, but they're certainly talking about upscaling their scale of effort and becoming better able to work alongside NATO. And so I think that NATO, Ireland, if you like, perhaps has the good fortune to be as far west as you can be in Europe, almost, if you like, in terms of the sea is next to it. But yes, I go back to the Second World War. Ireland was independent in the Second World War, but their neutrality was considerably compromised. If it had suited our purposes, the British would have, used their facilities or done what we needed to pursue our aims. Neutrality, in my book, is not an option we want to pursue.
Okay.
Yeah, just a quick question on your thoughts on, aside from the military aspects of a defence requirement, how do we go about standing up security forces and that side of defence, and how would that integrate with existing agencies, and how will we go about that?
Well, when you say security forces, do you mean intelligence efforts and
Yes.
that sort of thing?
Yes.
Well, the first thing I would say is that I am not a member of the intelligence community. I never have been. That is an area that I'm not particularly familiar with at all. But I would say that, like every other sovereign state, we would have to address those concerns. To my knowledge, all of the Baltic states have developed and run their own, if you like, security agencies that look to that more covert, more concealed security of their countries. And I don't think it's any accident at all that NATO's cyber capability centre is based in Tallinn, one of the most wired communities in Europe, if not the world. And certainly all of the three Baltic states are very, very aware of the cyber threat and that side of security as well. I'm sorry that doesn't answer your question particularly well, but it is an area that we would have to address, and there are people with the skill sets to do that, I am sure.
Cliff, did you want to add anything for the next question?
No, it's the cyber threat that we would face would be exactly the same as what we're facing just now, and probably a lot more enhanced if it was found that we were wanting in that field. They would definitely go after us, use us as a backdoor into other systems. So yes, we definitely have to have some sort of agency looking after that type of thing.
Craig Murray,
Yeah, I'd like to mention what I think is an elephant in the room. Personally, I think it's unlikely that Vladimir Putin is going to attempt an amphibious landing on the Clyde, but I'm prepared to accept it's not impossible and should be guarded against. But it seems to me, you mentioned Finland and Finland's long border with Russia, and of course Finland's historical experience of being invaded by Russia, and therefore you're very sympathetic to Finland's need to have strong security forces to guard against any future invasion by Russia, and I would agree with that. But it seems to me that Scotland has one country which historically has invaded it repeatedly, and that the biggest threat to any newly independent country is the country it has seceded from. That is bound to be the most immediate threat. And England at the moment is politically schizophrenic. It has become ultra-nationalist. We've seen Brexit as a kind of spasm of racism. We've got a dysfunctional Westminster Parliament, which is just getting rid of yet another Tory Prime Minister and looking to elect the person who comes up with the most extreme solutions for sending people to Rwanda to appease its nationalist base. We have a dangerous, historically hostile, repeatedly invaded and politically schizoid neighbour to our south, which has invaded us again and again. And it is far more likely, I don't actually believe either scenario is likely as improbable, but if you ask me, is it more likely that England will invade an independent Scotland, or more likely that Russia will invade an independent Scotland, I would say to 1,000 times it is more likely England will invade an independent Scotland. And surely that is how our defence force needs to be configured. And what interests me, because a very great deal, and I'm not intending to be hostile, a very, very great deal of what you have said, I agree with. A great deal of your explanation, which I thought was excellent. But what I'm interested in is how people from a British Army background react to the idea that a major targeting of future defence policy has to be defence against England.
Leopards don't change their spots. I have to say I have a considerable degree of sympathy with what you say there.
Craig, could you pass the microphone down?
Sorry. Yes. And my fifth task, if you like, refers to new and increasing threats, and perhaps I was alluding to something very similar to what you were saying there.
And Cliff, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it goes back to the whole purpose of the Scottish Defence Force is to defend the nation against all attacks, whether it's cyber attacks or whether it's boots on the ground type of attacks. As highly unlikely as it is that they would come across the border again, but that's why we would have a Scottish Defence Force.
Okay. All right, and we will take our last question from yourself.
As a former ex-serviceman, how would the Scottish Defence Force be made up as to infantry components, light armoured components, artillery, that they're going to take up the form of British Army battle groups, where you've got half armour, half infantry support, to defend an independent Scotland?
I certainly believe that structures, various people talk about sort of radically different structures in terms of units, but whether you look at French units, German units, British units within the office, there is a fairly similar pattern to them. The Soviets or the Russians now have a rather different way of organising their forces, which push logistics, I would say, to a higher level. But certainly I would see a Scottish Defence Force land component built around independent battalion groups.
Cliff, if you would want to chime in, and then I'd like to give, I'm sorry, just very quickly, and then I'd like to give each of our panel participants just an opportunity to briefly summarize their thoughts. So go ahead and Cliff on that, and then if you could give your concluding thoughts, and then we'll give Andrew an opportunity.
Again, it goes back to what role the Scottish Defence Force will be taking, and then they can build the land forces around that role with, as Andrew said there, room for expansion. So, yes, thanks for having us on today, and thanks for people asking the questions. We need to get out I feel we need to get out into the armed forces community and start getting the message across to them what we're trying to achieve in an independent Scotland. Let's wrest the narrative away from Westminster on this one. And one of the best weapons we can use for deploying this one is honesty. If we get asked a question, let's give honest answers. If we don't know the answer, let's be sure we get back to them with the correct answer thereafter. I'm an entirely optimistic kind of person, and I really do think that we are now entering into a phase of great change for Scotland, and that will of course be finished off with us achieving our independence.
Any concluding remarks, Andrew?
Just if I can make a couple of it, back up, I think, onto the points that Cliff has made. I've long thought that the British government possess in the British Armed Forces one of the best trained armed forces and most capable armed forces there is man for man. It's just a pity that perhaps the British government is one of the governments that least deserves to have them. And that I think that, as Cliff has alluded to, a Scottish Defence Force, I think, could do better in terms of its terms and conditions of service for those that choose to join a Scottish Defence Force. The other thing that I didn't mention and perhaps wants to mention, so I'll mention it now, is the business of legacy equipments. There's frankly not much in my mind that is currently in the British Armed Forces orbit that we would want to move across to a Scottish Defence Force. So the business, I don't know, of taking 8.5% of this, that or the other, to me is a bit of a nonsense. We want to set up a Scottish Defence Force with the equipment that we need for the tasks that we have. But we don't necessarily have the luxury of choice all the time. We can't be in the business of choosing to pay 4 times as much for our helicopters as the Americans did because we want them to have a particular capability. We will have to take certain things off the shelf that might therefore moderate our style of using them. And the other thing I would say is, just as the bolts did, it's better to have an equipment in a unit so that that unit has a rationale and a purpose and something it can train with along the lines of its mission than not having that. So taking on some legacy equipment that are suboptimal as essentially a training tool for establishing your units and establishing your identity and your structures is probably better than not having equipment at all. Each of the Baltic states benefited from the Swedish army, which was downsizing at the time, kindly donated to each of the Baltic armed forces a brigade's worth of equipment. It wasn't necessarily what they wanted, but it gave them a huge start in terms of setting up units with a degree of capability. Thanks very much.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right, so we're back in 15 minutes sharp, and for the international recognition.